Night settled over the wilderness of Judea slowly, as though the sky itself was unwilling to close the day too quickly, lingering for a moment longer before letting the last traces of light fade into the deep, quiet blue of the desert night. The land grew still beneath the vast heavens, and the silence felt wide and patient, not empty, but full of a quiet presence that could be felt rather than heard. Jagged hills of dry stone stretched endlessly beneath the stars, their rough outlines softened by darkness, while countless small points of light appeared above, steady and distant, like gentle reminders that even in the most desolate places the sky continued to watch over the earth below. These stars did not blaze or shout for attention, they simply remained, calm and unchanging, as they had for generations before. A cool wind passed through the wilderness, weaving its way between narrow valleys and along the faces of ancient cliffs, brushing lightly against the hardened ground before slipping away into the night. It carried no violence, no urgency, only the quiet breath of the desert as it rested after the heat of the day, moving softly enough that it seemed to invite the world to slow down with it. Hidden among the rocky slopes was a cave, dark and deep, its entrance barely visible unless one knew where to look. Within its shadowed interior, the stone walls offered shelter from watchful eyes beyond the hills, and the darkness gathered thickly, protecting those who had sought refuge inside from the danger that searched for them outside. David was there. He sat with his back against the cold rock, his body still, allowing his eyes to adjust to the dimness and his ears to sharpen to every faint sound carried through the night. Sleep did not come easily to him, not because his body lacked weariness, but because his exhaustion ran deeper than his muscles, settling quietly into his thoughts, where memory and uncertainty moved slowly, one after another. This was not the first night David had spent like this, resting on hard ground beneath an open sky, with stone beneath him and silence surrounding him on every side. He had grown familiar with nights without comfort, nights without shelter, nights where the only place to lift his eyes was upward, toward the heavens, where he had learned long ago to place his trust in the Lord who watched over him. He was far from the palace now. There were no long corridors lit by oil lamps, no echoes of footsteps from servants passing nearby, no music drifting through open halls. All that remained was the roughness of stone, the chill of the night air, and a stillness so complete that even the smallest sound, a shifting footstep, a falling pebble, could cause the heart to pause and listen. David knew why. Somewhere beyond the cave, beyond the darkness that wrapped around the hills, King Saul was still searching for him, leading men who had been commanded to hunt him down, driven by fear that had slowly taken root in a heart once chosen by God, but now restless and unsettled. It was not justice that fueled the pursuit, nor truth, but a growing unease that had turned suspicion into resolve. David had done nothing to deserve this. He had not betrayed the king, nor raised his hand in rebellion, nor spoken against the throne. Yet he found himself treated as an enemy, forced to flee through the wilderness, carrying with him the quiet pain of being misunderstood by the one he had once served faithfully. Inside the cave, David shifted slightly, placing his hands upon his knees and focusing on the slow rhythm of his breathing, as though anchoring his heart before it could be swept away by thoughts of injustice and loss. He knew that if such thoughts were allowed to grow unchecked, they would harden into bitterness, and bitterness would lead him down a path he did not wish to walk. So he chose silence. Not the silence of despair, but the silence of waiting, the stillness of a man learning to trust when answers had not yet been given. Outside, the wilderness remained calm beneath the stars, and within the darkness of the cave, David stayed where he was, holding fast to the quiet faith he had carried with him since his earliest days as a shepherd, trusting that the God who had guided him then was still watching now. As the night stretched on, the darkness within the cave seemed to grow thicker, not heavier, but deeper, wrapping itself around the stone walls and softening their sharp edges until the space felt less like a hiding place and more like a quiet refuge carved by time itself. David remained still, listening, not only for the sounds of danger beyond the cave, but also for the subtle movements within his own heart, where memories surfaced gently, one after another, uninvited yet familiar, like old songs returning in the silence. He remembered the fields of Bethlehem, where nights were once filled with the low sounds of sheep settling into rest, and where the sky felt close enough to touch. In those days, solitude had not felt threatening, it had felt holy, a place where prayers rose naturally, carried upward by simple faith and untroubled trust. Back then, his hands had held a shepherd's staff, not a sword, and his worries had been small and clear, focused only on guarding what had been entrusted to him. When danger came, it had come openly, in the form of wild beasts, and he had learned to face it with courage rooted not in strength, but in confidence that the Lord was near. Those memories lingered now, drifting quietly through his thoughts, reminding him that the God who had watched over him in the fields had not changed, even though everything else around him had. Yet the present felt far more complex. This wilderness was not the open pasture of his youth, and the danger he faced did not come from animals, but from men who carried weapons, men who followed orders, men who believed they were doing what was right. And at the center of it all stood Saul, the king David had once honored, whose voice he had once obeyed, whose pain he had once tried to ease with music and loyalty.
The thought of Saul brought with it a quiet ache. David had stood before him many times, harp in hand, watching as troubled shadows passed over the king's face, and he had played, not to be seen, but to serve, trusting that kindness would always find its way home. He had never imagined that those same hands, once welcomed into the palace, would one day be forced to hide in caves. The injustice of it all pressed gently against his heart, not sharply, but persistently, like a question whispered again and again without an answer. Why would faithfulness lead here? Why would obedience end in exile? These were not questions spoken aloud, but they lingered nonetheless, suspended in the quiet air of the cave. David did not argue with them. Instead, he let them pass, as one lets clouds drift across the sky, acknowledging their presence without allowing them to darken everything beneath. He had learned, through years of walking with God, that not every question needed to be resolved immediately, and that trust often meant waiting without understanding. Around him, other men rested in the shadows, their breathing slow and steady, their bodies worn from long days of travel and constant vigilance. They had chosen to follow David, to share in his uncertainty and his danger, and the weight of that responsibility rested heavily upon him. Their lives were tied to his decisions now.
That thought alone could have filled him with fear, yet instead it drew him inward, pressing him closer to prayer, even when no words were formed. In the stillness, David entrusted them, and himself, into God's care, believing that the one who had called him would not abandon those who walked beside him. The night outside continued its quiet vigil. Stars held their places above the wilderness, unshaken by the struggles below, and the wind moved gently across the land, as if time itself had slowed to a restful pace. And within the shelter of stone and shadow, David remained awake, not restless, but watchful, carrying both memory and hope in equal measure, waiting for whatever the next moment would bring. As the hours passed, the night seemed to settle more fully into the wilderness, as though it had found its rightful place, resting upon the hills and valleys with a calm assurance that nothing needed to be rushed and nothing needed to be forced. David's breathing grew steadier, his body still alert, yet no longer tense, as if he had surrendered the weight of watchfulness into something quieter and more enduring. The cave remained dark, but the darkness no longer felt threatening. It felt like a covering, a pause in the long journey, a place where the soul could gather strength before moving forward once again. He lowered his gaze, resting it upon the uneven ground before him, and allowed his thoughts to turn gently toward God, not with elaborate words or urgent requests, but with a simple awareness of presence. He had learned that some prayers did not need to be spoken, that trust itself could become a form of worship when words failed.
In that stillness, David remembered the promises spoken over his life, promises he had never sought and honors he had never demanded. They had come quietly, unexpectedly, much like this night, and they had required patience rather than haste, humility rather than force. He knew that the path ahead would not be easy. There would be more nights like this one, more places of hiding, more moments when fear and faith would stand side by side, each asking to be chosen. Yet deep within him there remained a steady conviction that the Lord who had guided his steps thus far would continue to lead him, even through valleys shadowed by uncertainty. Around him, the men who followed him slept on, unaware of the quiet decisions being shaped in the silence of the cave. David felt the weight of leadership press gently upon him, not as a burden to be feared, but as a calling to be carried with care, marked by restraint, compassion, and obedience. He resolved, there in the darkness, that no matter what opportunities might arise, no matter how close deliverance might appear, he would not take what had not been given, nor would he raise his hand against what the Lord had established. The timing of justice, he believed, belonged to God alone. Outside, the wilderness remained unchanged, vast and indifferent to the struggles hidden within its folds. Yet beneath the open sky, unseen by human eyes, a quiet work was unfolding within David's heart, shaping him not through triumph, but through waiting. As the night moved slowly toward dawn, a faint sense of peace settled over him, not because danger had passed, but because trust had taken root. And there, within the shelter of stone and shadow, David rested in that peace, unaware that the coming hours would bring him face to face with a test that would reveal the depth of his faith and the strength of his restraint. For now, the cave held its silence, the wilderness held its breath, and David remained, waiting. Morning did not arrive suddenly in the wilderness, but unfolded slowly, almost reluctantly, as a faint, pale light began to slip across the edges of the hills, touching the stone with a softness that felt more like a whisper than a declaration of day. Inside the cave, the darkness loosened its hold just enough to reveal vague outlines, shadows within shadows, and the subtle movement of men stirring from uneasy rest. The night had passed, but the sense of danger had not, for this place of refuge was still surrounded by uncertainty, and safety remained fragile and temporary. David rose quietly, careful not to disturb those who slept nearby, and moved a little deeper into the cave, where the air felt cooler and the silence thicker. From there he could see the faint glow of daylight creeping toward the entrance, illuminating dust in the air that drifted slowly, unhurried, as if time itself had slowed within these stone walls. This cave, hidden among the cliffs of En Gedi, was not chosen by chance. The land around it was rugged and wild, marked by steep paths and narrow passes, offering shelter to those who knew how to disappear into its folds.
Springs flowed quietly nearby, sustaining life in a place that otherwise seemed unwilling to offer comfort, and the caves themselves stood like silent witnesses to countless stories of flight and survival. David had passed through many places like this before, yet something about this cave felt different, though he could not yet name why. Perhaps it was the stillness, deeper than before, or the sense that the quiet itself was waiting, holding something unseen within its breath. As the light grew stronger, faint sounds began to reach the cave from beyond the hills, the distant movement of men, the low murmur of voices carried on the air, the subtle signs that the wilderness was no longer empty. David listened closely, his body still, his mind alert, recognizing the sounds all too well. Saul was near. The realization settled over him without panic, but with a calm heaviness, like a truth already expected. He had known this moment would come again, that hiding could not last forever, and that each refuge would eventually be tested. He glanced back at the men who followed him, seeing in their resting faces the weariness of long pursuit and the trust they had placed in him. They had left behind homes, families, and certainty to walk this path beside him, and their lives were bound to his choices in ways he did not take lightly.
David returned his gaze toward the cave's entrance, where the light now traced a narrow path across the ground, dividing shadow from brightness. That line seemed to hold meaning beyond itself, standing quietly between what was hidden and what would soon be revealed. He felt no urge to flee. Instead, a strange stillness settled within him, as though this place, this moment, had been prepared long before his arrival. The cave did not merely conceal, it waited, and so did he. Outside, footsteps drew closer. Armor shifted. Voices rose, then softened, and without yet knowing it, David stood on the threshold of a moment that would test not his strength, but his heart. A moment that would ask him to choose between what was easy and what was right, between taking control and trusting God's timing. For now, he remained silent, standing in the shadows of En Gedi, watching the light move slowly across the stone, unaware of how near the trial truly was. The sounds outside the cave grew clearer with each passing moment, carried by the morning air and echoed softly against the stone walls, until footsteps, voices, and the faint clink of armor could no longer be mistaken for anything else. Saul's men had arrived, moving through the rugged terrain with practiced caution, their presence filling the wilderness with a tension that felt heavy even from within the shadows.
David retreated farther into the cave, signaling quietly to the men with him to remain still, to make no sound, to let the darkness continue to hide them. Bodies pressed closer to the rock, breaths were held, and every movement slowed to the smallest possible measure, as though even the cave itself had joined in their silence. Then, from beyond the entrance, a single figure approached. King Saul stepped inside. The brightness of the morning sun framed his silhouette for a brief moment before he moved farther into the cave, leaving the light behind and entering the dim interior, unaware of the eyes watching him from the darkness. He had come seeking rest, not danger, drawn by the shelter of stone and the illusion of safety that the cave offered. David watched, his heart steady yet alert, as Saul laid aside his spear and shield, his posture easing as though the weight of command had been set down, if only for a moment. The king, who commanded armies and ruled a nation, stood vulnerable now, unguarded and alone, surrounded by shadows that concealed the very man he sought to destroy. The irony of the moment did not escape David. Here stood the one who pursued him relentlessly, now within arm's reach, completely unaware of how close he was to the edge of his own fate. The cave, once a place of hiding, had suddenly become a place of possibility, holding within it a power to change everything in a single breath. Behind David, barely audible whispers began to stir. Men leaned toward him, their voices low and urgent, their words shaped by exhaustion and hope. They spoke of deliverance, of opportunity, of a moment granted by God Himself. Surely this was the end of running, the end of fear, the end of life in shadows. David did not respond at once. He felt the weight of their expectations pressing against him, mingling with his own thoughts, his own long nights of exile and loss. He knew how easily this moment could be interpreted as permission, how simple it would be to reach for what lay so close, to claim freedom through force. His hand moved instinctively toward the hilt of his sword, not in anger, but in awareness of its presence. The metal felt cold beneath his fingers, solid and real, a reminder of how thin the line was between restraint and action. Saul remained still, unaware, exposed, human. In that silence, time seemed to stretch, slowing to a pace that allowed every thought, every impulse to be fully felt. David stood between two paths, both clear, both demanding a choice, one that would be made not before men, but before God. The cave held its breath, and David waited. The whispers behind David faded into silence, as though even the men who followed him sensed that this moment no longer belonged to many voices, but to one heart alone. The cave felt smaller now, not because the stone walls had moved, but because the weight of choice had filled every corner of the space. David took a slow step forward, not toward violence, but toward understanding. Each movement was careful, measured, as if he were walking across sacred ground rather than rough stone. His eyes never left Saul, who remained unaware, his guard lowered, his authority temporarily set aside in the stillness of the cave. David's thoughts did not rush. They moved quietly, shaped by years of walking with God, by nights spent under open skies, by lessons learned not through victory, but through waiting. He remembered the oil poured upon his head long ago, the words spoken by the prophet, the calling he had never sought, yet could never escape. But he also remembered something else. Saul was still the Lord's anointed, not perfect, not just, not at peace, yet chosen. That truth settled firmly within David's heart, anchoring him against the rising tide of emotion that threatened to carry him elsewhere. He understood, in that moment, that taking Saul's life would not bring the freedom he longed for, nor would it heal the wounds left by exile and betrayal. Power taken by force would leave scars no crown could cover. David drew closer, his footsteps swallowed by the darkness, until he stood near enough to see the weariness etched into Saul's face, the lines carved by fear and struggle, the signs of a man burdened by a calling he could no longer carry with ease. Compassion stirred quietly within him. Not weakness, not surrender, but restraint. Slowly, deliberately, David reached out, not with his sword raised, but with a hand guided by conviction rather than impulse. The blade did not strike flesh. Instead, it brushed against fabric, cutting only the edge of Saul's robe, a small, almost unnoticeable act, yet one heavy with meaning. The sound was barely there, a soft tear of cloth, nothing more. Yet the moment it happened, David felt a sharp pang within his chest, as though even this small action had crossed a line his conscience guarded closely. He stepped back at once, retreating into the shadows, his heart pounding not with triumph, but with awareness. Saul remained unharmed, unaware, alive. The cave returned to stillness, but it was no longer the same stillness as before. Something had shifted, not outside, but within David himself. He knew now with quiet certainty that he would not lift his hand against the king, no matter how close deliverance appeared. Justice, he believed, belonged to God. Timing, too. As Saul prepared to leave the cave, stepping once more into the light of day, David stayed behind in the shadows, holding in his hand a small piece of cloth, simple and torn, yet carrying the weight of a choice that would shape everything that followed. The cave which had hidden him had also revealed him to himself. And as the echoes of Saul's footsteps faded into the wilderness, David remained still, aware that the true battle had already been fought, not with steel, but within the quiet depths of a faithful heart. The cave did not release David at once, as though the place itself understood that what had just occurred needed space to settle, not only in memory, but deep within the heart. For a moment longer, he remained in the shadows, still and quiet, allowing the silence to confirm the decision already made, allowing restraint to become something firm rather than fragile. In his hand, the torn piece of cloth felt light, nearly insignificant, yet its meaning pressed upon him with unmistakable weight. It was proof, not of power, but of mercy, not of victory, but of a boundary he had chosen not to cross. David closed his fingers around it briefly, then loosened his grip, as if releasing the last trace of tension from his body. Outside the cave, the wilderness had fully awakened. Sunlight spread across the rocks of En Gedi, warming the stone and revealing every ridge and path with gentle clarity. Voices carried through the open air, and among them was Saul's, steady, commanding, unaware that his life had passed within reach of a blade guided instead by conscience. Orders were given, movements resumed, and the pursuit prepared to continue, unchanged in appearance, though forever altered beneath the surface. David listened carefully, not with bitterness and not with fear, but with a calm resolve shaped by obedience rather than impulse. Behind him, the men who followed him watched in silence, their expressions marked with conflicting emotions: relief that blood had not been spilled, confusion that deliverance had been delayed, and questions they did not yet voice. David did not explain himself to them. Not yet. He turned toward the mouth of the cave and began to walk forward, each step slow and deliberate, feeling the clear transition as darkness gave way to light, as the cool stillness of the cave yielded to the warmth of open air. It felt like crossing more than a physical threshold. It felt like stepping into the visible expression of a choice already sealed in the hidden place. When David emerged fully into the light, there was nothing about him that suggested authority or strength by human measure. Dust clung to his garments, his appearance bore the marks of long days spent in hiding, and his life stood in sharp contrast to the king he addressed. Yet there was a quiet steadiness in him, a peace not drawn from safety, but from alignment with what he knew to be right. Saul stood some distance away, surrounded by his men, his back turned as preparations were made to continue the search. He did not see David at first, did not know that the one he hunted now stood openly behind him, no longer concealed by stone and shadow. Then David lifted his voice, not raised in challenge, not sharpened by accusation, clear, steady, and restrained. "My lord, the king." The sound carried across the open space, cutting through movement and conversation, drawing attention without force. Saul turned, startled, and in that moment the world seemed to slow once more as eyes met across the distance between them, between pursuit and surrender, between power and humility.
David did not move closer. Instead, he bowed low, lowering himself fully to the ground, his face toward the earth, placing himself in a posture of respect that could not be misunderstood. This was no act of strategy, no display meant to manipulate, but a genuine expression of honor freely given, even when it had not been received. The wilderness fell silent. Men stood motionless, breaths were held, and in that stillness, under the open sky, David prepared to speak, not to justify himself with force, not to claim what could have been taken, but to reveal truth through gentleness, trusting that the God who had restrained his hand in the darkness of the cave would now guide his words in the full light of day. David remained bowed for a moment longer than necessary, not because he feared the king's response, but because humility, once chosen, was not something to be rushed. When he finally lifted his head, his posture remained low, his voice calm, shaped by care rather than urgency, as though each word had been weighed before being released into the open air. He spoke not to accuse, but to appeal. He asked why the king listened to voices that whispered lies, why Saul believed those who said David sought his harm, when every step of his life had been marked by loyalty rather than rebellion. There was no bitterness in his tone, no sharp edge of resentment, only the quiet sorrow of a man who had been misunderstood by the one he had served with sincerity.
David gestured gently, careful not to provoke fear, and then he revealed the torn piece of the robe, holding it up where the light could touch it clearly. The fabric fluttered slightly in the breeze, small and unremarkable, yet its presence spoke louder than any defense he could have formed with words alone. He explained what had happened in the cave, how Saul had stood within reach, how the opportunity had presented itself without effort, how no one would have known, and yet how his hand had not been raised, not because he lacked the chance, but because he feared the Lord more than he desired relief. He spoke of restraint not as a loss, but as obedience, not as weakness, but as trust in a justice greater than his own. David's words did not hurry. They moved slowly, leaving space between thoughts, allowing the truth to rest where it landed. He made it clear that he sought neither Saul's life nor his throne, that he desired only peace, and that he trusted the outcome of his life to the God who judges rightly. As he spoke, the air seemed to change. Saul stood silent, his gaze fixed on the piece of cloth, recognition dawning gradually, like light breaking through heavy clouds. The meaning of the moment reached him not all at once, but in layers. First surprise, then realization, and finally something deeper, something that trembled beneath the surface. The king's expression softened. The tension in his stance eased, and when he spoke, his voice no longer carried the authority of command, but the vulnerability of a man confronted by mercy he did not expect. He acknowledged David's righteousness, admitting that good had been returned for evil, that kindness had answered pursuit. Emotion broke through his words, not loudly, not dramatically, but unmistakably. Tears filled Saul's eyes as he confessed what had long been avoided, that David would one day be king, and that the Lord's hand was with him. In that moment, the pursuit paused, not because the danger had vanished forever, but because truth had been spoken openly, and mercy had revealed itself more powerful than force. David listened without pride. He did not rise to claim victory, nor did he press the moment further than it would bear. He accepted Saul's words with quiet dignity, knowing that repentance, like trust, was fragile and could not be demanded or controlled. The wilderness, which had witnessed the chase, now witnessed restraint. Men on both sides stood still, aware that they were standing within a moment that would be remembered not for bloodshed, but for mercy freely given. And David, still marked by humility, waited calmly, allowing the weight of the encounter to settle where it would, trusting God with what would follow. For a long moment after Saul's words faded into the open air, no one moved. The wilderness seemed to pause with them, as if the land itself were bearing witness to what had just been spoken, not a declaration of power, but a confession shaped by mercy. David remained where he was, neither advancing nor retreating, allowing silence to complete what words could not. He understood that moments like this could not be pressed or prolonged without losing their meaning. What had been revealed was enough, and anything more would belong to God alone. When he finally rose from the ground, he did so slowly, with the same gentleness that had guided his steps out of the cave. He did not look at David with triumph nor with expectation, but with a steady calm that reflected acceptance rather than relief. The future remained uncertain, and David did not pretend otherwise. He spoke only briefly. He affirmed once more that he sought no harm, that his life remained in the Lord's hands, and that he would continue to walk the path set before him, wherever it might lead. There was no demand for promises, no insistence on reconciliation, only a quiet release of control. Saul listened, his gaze lingering on David, as though trying to reconcile the man before him with the fear that had driven the pursuit for so long. He offered his own final words, softer now, carrying a tone of resignation mixed with clarity, before turning away to rejoin his men.
The separation was simple. No celebration, no resolution that erased all danger, just two paths moving apart under the same sky. Saul and his men departed into the wilderness, their footsteps gradually fading into distance, while David stood watching until the movement disappeared beyond the ridges of En Gedi. He did not follow, he did not hurry away, he simply remained, breathing in the stillness left behind. Behind him, the men who had followed him stepped closer, not with questions this time, but with understanding. They had seen restraint where revenge had been expected, patience where force had been available. Without many words, they understood that this was the kind of leader David was becoming. As the day continued, the wilderness returned to its quiet rhythm. Wind moved gently through the cliffs, light shifted slowly across the stone, and David turned back toward the place of shadow, not as a man hiding in fear, but as one choosing wisdom over impulse. He knew the journey was not finished. There would be more trials, more waiting, more moments where faith would need to stand firm without immediate reward.
Yet beneath all of it, a deep sense of peace settled within him. Not because circumstances had changed, but because his heart had remained aligned with God's timing. And in that alignment, David found rest. Not the rest of safety, but the rest of trust. A rest that did not depend on enemies disappearing, but on the quiet assurance that when revenge was refused and mercy was chosen, God himself would carry the story forward. After the voices faded and the wilderness reclaimed its quiet, David did not hurry away. He remained where he was for a while longer, allowing the stillness to settle fully, as though peace itself needed time to arrive, moving slowly, gently, without force. The cliffs of En Gedi stood unchanged, their ancient faces catching the light of the sun, indifferent to human conflict, yet faithful in their silent witness. Wind passed softly through the narrow paths, brushing against stone and carrying with it a sense of release, as if the land exhaled after holding its breath. David turned back toward the cave, not as a place of fear, but as a place of reflection. The darkness within no longer felt heavy. It felt familiar, even kind, like a quiet companion that had sheltered him through a moment that would shape his soul more than any victory ever could. Inside, the air was cool and calm. He sat down again, resting his back against the rock, allowing his body to ease, allowing the tension he had carried for so long to slowly loosen its grip. His hands, once clenched around uncertainty, now rested open upon his knees, empty, unburdened. There was no sudden rush of relief, no surge of triumph, only a deep, steady calm that spread quietly through him, not rising from circumstances, but flowing from obedience. David understood that the greatest battle he had faced that day had not taken place in the cave, nor in the open wilderness, but within his own heart, where the desire to end suffering had met the call to trust God's timing. He reflected on how close the moment had been, how easily his life could have turned in another direction, how thin the line had been between restraint and regret. Yet instead of fear at what might have been, gratitude filled him for what had been prevented. Mercy had not only spared Saul, it had preserved David himself, keeping his heart free from a weight he was never meant to carry. Around him, his men moved quietly, speaking little, sensing that words were unnecessary. They too felt the shift, the calm that followed a choice made in faith. Without being instructed, they lowered their voices, their movements gentle, as though honoring the peace that had settled among them. David lifted his eyes, not toward the entrance of the cave, but upward, toward the unseen sky beyond the stone. And in that moment, a prayer formed, not spoken aloud, but deeply felt. It was not a request for safety, nor a plea for the future, but a simple offering of trust, given freely, without condition. He did not know what the days ahead would bring, but he knew who walked with him, and that knowledge was enough. Time moved differently inside the cave, no longer measured by urgency or fear, but by quiet breaths and gentle pauses. David sat in stillness, aware of each moment as it passed, yet no longer pressed by the need to act or decide. The trial had come and it had passed, leaving behind not exhaustion, but clarity. He understood now, more deeply than before, that peace was not the absence of danger, but the presence of trust. The wilderness had not changed, Saul still lived, the future remained uncertain, and yet something within David had settled into a steadier place, one that could not be shaken easily by what lay ahead. In the silence, he considered the slow shaping of his life, how the path from shepherd to warrior, from servant to fugitive, had not followed a straight line, but a winding road marked by waiting, misunderstanding, and restraint. None of it had been wasted. Each season had taught him something strength alone never could. Victory had taught him confidence. Exile had taught him humility. Waiting had taught him faith. And now, mercy had taught him peace. David realized that kingship, if it were ever to come, would not be defined by power taken, but by authority entrusted. What he had refused in the cave mattered as much as anything he might one day receive. The crown, he knew, would carry weight, and the heart beneath it would need to be able to bear that weight without being hardened by it. He listened to the soft sounds around him, the faint movement of his men, the quiet brushing of wind against stone, the distant call of birds awakening beyond the cliffs. These ordinary sounds, once overshadowed by danger, now felt grounding, reminders that life continued even after moments of great testing. His men watched him with new eyes. They had seen courage before, but this was different. This was courage without spectacle, strength without display. They did not cheer or speak of what had happened, but their respect deepened, not because David had spared a king, but because he had ruled his own heart. David sensed this change without needing words. Leadership, he understood, was being formed in silence, not through command, but through example. The way he chose restraint had quietly shaped those who followed him, teaching them that faithfulness could be stronger than force, and patience more powerful than haste. As the day moved on, light shifted across the mouth of the cave, slowly stretching, then retreating, marking time without demand. David remained present, neither rushing forward nor clinging to what had passed, content to rest in the space obedience had created. There was a quiet joy in that rest, not excitement, not relief, but a calm assurance that he had walked rightly, even when no one would have known if he had chosen otherwise. That knowledge, known fully only by God, became a source of strength deeper than approval or reward. And so David stayed there, in the cool shelter of stone, letting peace finish its work within him, preparing him for a future that would require the same trust again and again, long after this day had faded into memory. As the day slowly leaned toward evening, the light outside the cave softened, losing its sharpness and settling into warmer tones that rested gently upon the stone. Shadows lengthened across the ground, moving unhurriedly, as though time itself had chosen to slow its pace. David remained seated, his posture relaxed, his mind no longer crowded by questions that demanded immediate answers. He had learned, through this quiet victory, that some things could be entrusted to God without needing to be resolved at once. The wilderness returned to its familiar rhythm. Wind moved softly along the cliffs. Birdsong faded into distance. The air cooled as the sun lowered beyond the hills. Within the cave, peace deepened, not as a fleeting feeling, but as a steady presence that settled into the spaces once occupied by fear and urgency. David felt no need to revisit the moment in the cave again and again. What mattered had already been decided, and the weight of that decision no longer pressed upon him.
He knew that life would continue to ask for patience. There would be more days of uncertainty, more nights of waiting, more moments when the strength would be tested once again. Yet the peace he carried now was not fragile. It had been shaped in secrecy, strengthened in silence, and anchored in obedience. It was the kind of peace that could walk through future storms without being undone by them. David stood at last, moving quietly, and stepped toward the entrance of the cave. He paused there, looking out across the land, now bathed in the gentle glow of approaching dusk. The same wilderness that had once felt threatening now appeared wide and calm, not because it had changed, but because he had. Behind him, his men prepared to move on, their actions unhurried, their voices low. They followed not just his direction, but his spirit, carrying with them the same quiet confidence that had taken root in him. David did not speak of the future. He did not speak of the throne. He simply walked forward, trusting that the path ahead would unfold in its proper time, just as this day had unfolded, one step at a time, under the watchful care of God. As evening settled fully over the land and the first stars began to appear once more, David moved on with peace in his heart, knowing that the greatest victory he had known was not the one that could be seen, but the one that had taken place quietly, when he chose not to take revenge and allowed God to remain the author of his story.
Long after the cave had faded behind him, and the path ahead stretched once more into uncertainty, the lesson of that day remained quietly alive within David. It did not announce itself with words, nor demand attention, but rested gently in his heart, like a truth that no longer needed to prove itself. David came to understand that the deepest lessons are rarely learned in moments of noise or display. They are formed instead in hidden places, when no one is watching closely, when choices are made without witnesses, and obedience carries no immediate reward. The cave had offered him an ending, a way out of fear, a release from pursuit, a chance to force the future into his own hands. Yet David had discovered that refusing an ending can sometimes open a far greater beginning. By choosing restraint, he had allowed God to continue writing the story, line by line, in a way no human decision ever could. As he walked with his men through the quiet valleys and rugged paths, David noticed how differently he carried himself now. His steps were steady, not hurried. His thoughts were clearer, less divided. The weight he bore was still present, but it no longer pressed upon him with the same heaviness. He had learned that waiting is not wasted time. Waiting shapes the heart. Waiting refines desire. Waiting teaches trust without conditions.
David realized that many battles are not meant to be won quickly, and many answers are not meant to arrive all at once. Some victories unfold slowly, revealing their meaning only after patience has done its quiet work. In moments of rest, David reflected on how easily anger disguises itself as justice and how fear often presents itself as urgency. The cave had stripped those disguises away, leaving him with a clearer vision of what faith truly required. Faith, he understood, was not proven by bold action alone, but by the courage to remain still when every instinct urges movement. It was the strength to place power back into God's hands, even when holding it for oneself would feel easier. The lessons settled deeper with time. Mercy protects the heart of the one who offers it. Restraint preserves what force would damage. Trust keeps the soul light, even on heavy roads. David did not speak these lessons aloud to his men. He lived them quietly, allowing his choices to teach what words never could. And as they traveled on, the calm that had taken root within him began, slowly and naturally, to shape the spirit of those who walked beside him. The wilderness remained vast. The future remained unknown. But David's heart had grown quieter, steadier, and more prepared for whatever lay ahead, guided not by haste or fear, but by a deepening trust that continued to unfold, step by patient step.
The lesson of the cave does not belong only to David. It moves quietly across time, reaching hearts that, like his, feel pressed by waiting, misunderstood by others, or tempted to end pain through force rather than trust. There are moments when life places opportunity close within reach, moments that appear to promise relief, justice, or control. These moments often feel urgent, convincing us that delay is loss and restraint is weakness. Yet David's story whispers a different truth, one that speaks softly enough to be missed unless the heart is still. Not every door that opens is meant to be entered. Not every chance is a calling. Not every solution carries peace. The cave reminds us that the right choice is not always the fastest one, nor the one that seems most logical in the moment. Sometimes, the truest path forward is the one that preserves the heart, even if it prolongs the journey. For those who listen in the quiet of the night, burdened by decisions left unresolved, David's restraint offers gentle guidance. It suggests that trusting God may feel like standing still while everything urges movement, yet it is often in stillness that the soul finds rest. Waiting does not mean doing nothing. It means listening more deeply. It means choosing patience over reaction. It means allowing God to work beyond what can be seen. Many who hear this story may recognize their own caves, places of pressure, isolation, or hidden struggle. These spaces, though uncomfortable, can become places of formation rather than defeat. What happens within them shapes the heart more than what is taken from them. The story invites the listener to consider a simple question, asked not with judgment, but with compassion. What is being formed in you while you wait? Is it bitterness or trust? Is it fear or quiet courage? David did not emerge from the cave with immediate answers, but he emerged with a heart protected from regret. In the same way, choosing restraint today may not resolve everything at once, but it can guard the soul from wounds that take far longer to heal. As the night deepens, this lesson does not demand action, it simply offers rest, a reminder that God's timing does not rush and His purposes do not depend on human force. Peace often arrives not when circumstances change, but when the heart releases its need to control what was never meant to be carried alone. And in that release, the soul begins to rest. As the night grows deeper and the world around you becomes quieter, the story of David no longer asks to be understood, only to be received. Its meaning does not press forward with urgency, but settles gently, like calm water smoothing the surface of the soul. You are not required to resolve every struggle tonight. You are not asked to force clarity from uncertainty. You are simply invited to rest. Just as David entrusted the outcome of his story to God, you too may release what weighs upon your heart. The questions that have lingered, the decisions still waiting for time, the tensions that remain unresolved, none of these need to be carried into the night. Trust does not demand explanation. It does not require certainty. It only asks for surrender. The cave that once held fear became a place of formation, and the same can be true for the quiet spaces you find yourself in now. What feels like waiting may be shaping patience. What feels like delay may be preparing peace. As breathing slows and thoughts begin to soften, remember this gentle truth. The future does not depend on how tightly you hold it. It unfolds best when placed into hands greater than your own. There will be a time to act. There will be a time to speak. But now is a time to rest. Let the stillness of this moment settle around you. Allow the story to fade into the background, leaving only a sense of calm and quiet assurance. You are seen. You are guided. You are not alone. And as sleep begins to draw near, may your heart remain light, your thoughts unburdened, and your spirit at peace, resting in the same trust that carried David forward, one gentle step at a time.